John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today we're reading Hellblazer number 50. In the last couple issues, we had just finished a two-part story arc about a husband and wife couple that owned a pub that got burned down. And they died, and then they murdered and haunted the people that killed them. And then the last issue was all about the Lord of the Dance, who is the pagan god that would celebrate with the Norse people, I guess, before the Christians got there. And John talks to him, shows him that even though the holiday is called Christmas now and has been Christianized, there are still people that are having fun and dancing. So it doesn't really matter what it's called, does it? And at the end of that issue, we were left with John returning to his friend Kit's house, who he was recently reunited with, and we've been seeing they've had some kind of romantic feelings, but when he comes home in the middle of the night and finds Kit waiting for him after he hung out with the Lord of the Dance, their feelings are confirmed as they make out and begin to have sex. And that is where we left it on the last issue. So, first things first, with issue 50, we start with the cover. And unlike most covers, this cover doesn't have anything to do with the storyline inside. I think because it was the 50th issue, they just got someone to draw John Constantine in a cool pose. So this is John about to enter a back alley. There's pipes everywhere along a brick wall that John is leaning against. And he's got a lit cigarette and he's kind of looking back at us before he goes into that alley. And he kind of looks like he's wanting us to follow him. Almost as if he's got something hidden in that back alley that he wants you to see. And we see that this issue is written by Garth Ennis with art by William Simpson. And just so you know, this is a double-sized issue, so it's 40 pages. So this one might be a little bit longer than the usual episode. And on the first page, we see that we are starting exactly where we left off with Kit and John in bed. And they've been here for a while. It says they've been here for 3 days. And I don't think they were making love that entire time. I think they were just in bed cuddling, staying warm under the sheets, and making love in intervals. So John gets up to use the restroom, and as he goes there, this is funny, he's singing, "It's been a hard day's night," and he seems pretty happy. And the panel is holding on Kit, so we're not seeing what's going on with John, but he calls out from the bathroom saying, "Kit, I have to go out for a while, sweetheart." And she instantly turns kind of angry because they were just talking about how nice it's been the last 3 days, and they don't want to get out of bed, but all of a sudden he's got to for some reason. Then we cut to John in the bathroom when we find out why. And it's because he's looking at a sink that has a dead bird that has been gutted, and the guts have been strewn all over the sink and the mirror and the back wall. And on the mirror is written Hampstead Heath. And John, of course, not wanting to ruin the mood and everything, when Kit asks why he has to leave, kind of angrily, he says, just a little business to take care of. And then we cut to him being dressed and leaving the apartment, and he is very angry, of course. And we get some narration that says, "It isn't easy emptying the birds out of the sink without Kit noticing, especially with the bloody smell, but I just about managed it. I dress and I kiss Kit goodbye and I tell her I'll be back soon. And then I go out into the night, and whoever this sick figure is who's pissing me about, he'd better watch his arse as of now." And as John walks out the front door, we see that the name of this issue is Remarkable Lives. So apparently Hampstead Heath is some kind of park, or at least a place with a lot of trees that can be kind of spooky and you can hide in there easily. So I don't know if I said at the beginning, but it is the middle of the night that John walked out in. So John's walking through this park in the middle of the night, and the narration says, "Ooh, spooky shit. Just because you pick a dark little wood to meet in doesn't mean I'm scared of you, you sad bastard." But then as he's walking and thinking that, he turns and he sees a big wolf right next to a tree, and it is not a statue, it is a real wolf. And his narration says, My bravado disappears like piss from a shrunken bladder when I run into the wolf and it glares at me with human eyes. And then he looks up at the rest of the trees kind of in the distance, and he sees some other humanoid-looking creatures walking, and the narration continues. Then the others move past me from the undergrowth, some walking tall and strong as the day they died, some staggering, and a few crawling. Half of London's freaks and phantoms are here, and I'm smack in the middle of them. And then John turns as he hears a noise, and he sees one of these skeletal human-like persons, maybe it's a zombie or something, and it looks at John and it waves at him and says, "Constantine, follow." And upon seeing and hearing this, John thinks to himself, "Oh Christ, shit creek again." So John does begin to kind of follow him, but he keeps asking where they're going. But the corpse is not answering him. And then the corpse turns to him and we see that his face is kind of like falling apart. So it seems like it can't even speak now. And then John looks at the face and gets kind of disgusted. But then he hears a noise and he says, "Who's there?" And then someone from a tree nearby that's sitting on one of the roots answers, "I am." And we see that this guy is surrounded by the wolves and some of the other beings. So it seems like this is probably the guy that sent the message with the bird guts to John. And this guy looks like a man, kind of dressed like Johnny Cash or something from the 50s, all in black. He has an upside down cross necklace around his neck. And he says, "John Constantine, you got my message then. Relax, I won't hurt you." And John, who's always trying to pretend like he's not scared, he says, "Stroll friggin' on, pal." And the man laughs and says, "Do you know who I am?" And John begins to light a cigarette, trying to keep his cool still. And the narration's saying, "Let's cool down and get a grip here. Have a fag, smarten up, and don't show the bastard you're scared." So John replies to the man, "Of course. I've read about you. Never thought we'd meet. You're the hunter in the night with 1,000 names, but only one title. You're the king of the vampires." Then as we turn the page, we get a full splash image of a naked African man standing in front of Mount Kilimanjaro, and behind him in a tree, we see that there is some creature lurking. And this is a motif that goes through the whole comic, where throughout it, they will interject these splash pages that tell a little bit more of the story of the King of the Vampires and also a little bit of story of John Constantine. And I think that's because this was supposed to be like a jumping on point. So if you were a new reader, you would get some history on John. And for all the readers, new and old, we would get the backstory on the King of the Vampires. So over this splash page image, we get a box of text about the King of the Vampires that says, "No one knows where the King of the Vampires originated, or why he should be king, save that he was the first of that kind to walk the earth. But the identity of his first victim is common knowledge to those whose interests lie in such lore. The first to fall to the King of the Vampires was the first man on earth. For even as infant humanity was born from the evolutionary chain into the African savanna, full of hope and promise and potential for a magnificent future, so the dark things that hold us back and feed upon our weaknesses were gathering, mouths watering at the prospect of so succulent a feast. And when the first man had indeed grown to be a man, and his own children danced under the sun with their mother, the vampire crept from the forest and watched his prey. The moon rose over Kilimanjaro like a pearl in a lake of deep and perfect blue, and dark red blood shot from butchered arteries. Humanity's fate was sealed with the snapping of a neck, the tearing of skin, and the slow, luxuriant sucking of every drop of the crimson prize within." Then we cut from that very beautiful prose and the image of the African man to a full splash page image of John Constantine looking all cocky and brash, dressed in his usual suit and trench coat, and is smoking, of course. And he's standing in an alley with a bunch of graffiti, and it doesn't look very nice. And we see the words, "John Constantine, con man, joker, thief, magus. Who the hell is he?" So it's a very funny juxtaposition of this mysterious vampire and then this very basic, "Who's this asshole, John Constantine?" And then we cut back to the conversation between John and the King of the Vampires. And John's asking, "So what's all this about? Why are you leaving dead birds in my sink, and why the weirdo convention?" And the vampire answers, "Oh yes, the birds. I know there are easier ways to get your attention. Let's just say I was being overdramatic. But you must admit, it got you here. You're intrigued." And John says, "Up to a point. This kind of thing's par for the course to me, mate. Old news." And the King of Vampires says, "So I'm led to believe. I brought my children here tonight to meet with all the strangeness London has to offer. Great things are in the offing, and it's a good time to be talking to the malformed, the killers, the dead, the mad, everyone that the city has cast aside, or who walks outside its stupid boundaries. And you, more than any of them, you. Now, I suppose you think you've got nothing in common with them. And I think the King of Vampires is talking about all the acolytes that he has surrounded him with, the corpses, the crazy naked people that are following him around, and the wolves. So John looks at him kind of questioningly and says, "You're telling me? I mean, amongst lots of others, there's a fat bloke over there with steel spikes shoved through him from bollocks to throat and a 2-foot-long forked tongue. I don't honestly think we'd have a lot to talk about, do you?" And the King of Vampires kind of chuckles and says, "That's kind of funny. I like that. What about your, contemporaries? Some of them aren't what you'd call normal. You know who I mean. The others in your profession. What would you call them? Investigators?" And John scoffs at this and says, "Oh Christ, those bastards?" And the vampire says, "You don't like them?" And John replies, "If you're talking about all those pricks who use magic like it was water and dress up like twits, no, I friggin' well don't." And then we cut to another splash page, and this one is of John as he's trying to save the girl Astra in Newcastle. And if you've never read this story, this is pretty important to John's history, but that takes place in issues 10 and 11, and it's called Newcastle. It's a 2-part story. But basically, John was trying to exorcise a demon from a little girl. He failed, and she ended up dying. So we get this picture of John and Astra running. John is holding her hand and kind of pulling her along as giant teeth kind of gnash down around them. And the text says, "Little Astra's hand was still warm in his when Hell's teeth sliced through her arm and she disappeared below forever. That was 14 years ago and further north." Then we turn that page and we get another splash scene of the vampire's history. And the image is of a vampire in a blood orgy, is what I'm going to call it. There's a bunch of naked women around him, and his body is covered in blood. And in the background, we see other women that are also, looks like they're drinking blood too, or attacking people. And there's a bunch of corpses all over the ground. And the text says, "The vampire spent his happiest days in Rome, when Caesar's legions conquered the known world and decadence spread from the empire's bloated heart through veins carved across whole continents. He was there with his teeth sunk deep into that heart and draining the lazy tissues within. At orgies in the rich men's villas, senators and slaves alike gave themselves to him. Fallen under a glamour few could resist, and few would even want to. So bored were they with the everyday pleasures and seeking new, illicit thrills no matter what the cost. Lambs to the slaughter, thought the king of the vampires, and blood from rich women's hearts pitter-pattered across the grapes on the feast tables. He sank his fingers through flushed skin, tickled ribs with a touch so gentle it was maddening, and finally stabbed deep to grasp and tear the dripping, pumping prize beneath. Nights of wine and roses and rich red water of life. The delicious splendor that was Rome." Then we cut back to the talk with John and the vampire says, "You're bitter, aren't you? Then again, I've yet to meet a sorcerer whom you could call easygoing. Why don't you like them?" And John just flatly says, "'Cause they're all wankers. I mean, doesn't everything just go perfectly for them? A little bit of buggering about with spells and shit, and bingo, problem solved. And look at me, for Christ's sake. I can barely hold it together day to day. You're right, you really are. Easygoing? Never. Just look at all of them. Ever met the stranger or the baron or doctor? Shit, what's his name? Well, whatever. There's lots of bloody doctors. They're all total space cases, if you ask me. All wandering around being enigmatic. They've all disappeared up their own arses and forgotten about life." And the vampire interjects, "How about Jason Blood? Have you ever tried talking to him?" And John says, "Oh, I've met Jason Blood, and he's ready for the nut house, he is. I'm Jason Blood. I may have met you, or, no matter. I forget so much, but then so little matters, wouldn't you say?" And the vampire cuts in, "But you're different." And John answers, "Yeah, I sodding am. The rest of them might be content to spend their time fighting the Crimson Dongbiter or whoever, but I wanted to do something worthwhile. I thought the old bog god had promise, but he just bollocksed it all up. If he'd let me help him, he could have been something. But oh no. Instead of cleaning up the planet, and he could have done it easily, he sods off and starts fighting the friggin' vegetable wars, for God's sake." And then John takes a seat on one of the logs next to where they're talking, and he continues, "So everything just stays as shitty as it's always been, and I go on trying to sort out stuff like mad old bastards killing kids and so on, and as usual, I end up doing more harm than good. I don't even know why I try. Then we cut to another splash page of John, and he is in an asylum. He's in one of the padded cells, and he's got a straitjacket on so he can't move, and he's all bloody and beaten. And the narration says, the days in Ravenscar were bad, with doctors administering ECT that they knew would be pointless, leaving him shaking and spitting afterwards, unable to say even his own name for fear of biting through his tongue. But the nights were worse, when all the patients were sedated and locked in their rooms, tied down to iron beds, and the doors were bolted and gates barred. The attendants came to his cell and tortured him for hours. They'd heard he killed a little girl in Newcastle, and some had their own children, and they broke his fingers and knocked out teeth, leaving bruises that the doctors, who had children too, simply ignored in the morning. They kicked the shit out of him every night, and the only reason he hated them was that they wouldn't cut his throat and end the agony. Then we turn the page and cut to a piece of the vampire's history. We get a full splash page of a trench in World War I, and he is standing along the top berm of one of those trenches where you see barbed wire and their bodies strewn and cut up hanging from the barbed wire. And on the bottom of the trench, it's full of water and mud, but there's also skulls and dead bodies and also people who aren't quite dead where their intestines are like blown out and stuff. And the text says, the vampire had not seen such magnificent slaughter as those roasting hot days in July of 1916, when thousands upon thousands of boys who'd been told they were men died screaming on the Somme. Wave after wave of them broke on the German lines, while their officers dined on the chop and sherry far behind them, directing the massacre with the same enthusiasm they held for cricket. Why they were doing it mattered little to the vampire. He'd gone to war the way you or I would go to dine with so many delicacies on offer. He was spoiled for choice. He rested during the day and emerged at night when the killing was done, the last few miserable souls writhing in agony, spilling their bayonet/innards on the Flanders soil and taking far too long to die. He'd like these meals the best, when he could taste the feelings of betrayal and despair in their very blood. As he drank, he'd whisper to them what fool they were to trust their leaders, enjoying their misery when they'd realize the awful truth too late to rectify their lethal error. The king of the vampires found his food hanging on the barbed wire in no man's land, and he rejoiced in the depraved glory of a life that brought sick new wonders every day. Good times. And then we cut back to John and the vampire talking, and the vampire saying, there are few rewards for people like you, John. I have no idea why you do the things you do either, to be honest. And John cuts in, hold on, let's keep it at Constantine, okay? You haven't heard me getting chummy, have you? But then the king of the vampires goes over and talks to one of his minions, and John says, oi, what's the big secret? And the vampire answers, pardon me a moment, friend. There's something I have to attend to. Apparently, someone's been spying on us. And then John looks to the side as he hears some commotion, and he sees one of the minions of the king of vampires is bringing a policeman out of the woods and into the center of the group. And he gives the officer over to the king of the vampires, who says, oh dear, let me guess, you were walking past in the wood on patrol, and you heard voices, so you decided to investigate. And as he says this, he reaches behind the man's head, and he proceeds to grab his skull and rip it open. So skin, bone, and all, he exposes the brain from the back to the front. And John is just left there staring and saying, you poor bastard. And this police officer is still alive because he's still making noises like, ugh. And the king of the vampires looks at John as he's got this skull open, and he says, there, would you like some? No? Suit yourself. And he opens his mouth, and we see not only does he have pointy teeth, he's got a creepy, long snake tongue. And as he goes in for the bite, we do see that the man has a horrified look on his face, so he's still technically alive. And John looks away at the horror, and his narration says, the noises he makes are worse than the sight. This whole thing's unreal. I should be thinking about what this son of a bitch wants with me and how I can get the hell out of here. But I just can't think straight. All that comes to mind is a stupid sick joke about redheads. And then John opens his eyes and begins to look, and the king of vampires is literally slurping out of this guy's head, and the narration continues, it clicks with me at last the bastard isn't here for a pleasant chat. He's the king of the sodding vampires, and whatever he wants me here for, it's going to be bad news. What does he want? What am I going to do? And then we see the vampire drop the body, and the narration continues. He drops the corpse like a sack of shit, and it hits the deck with a heavy thump that snaps me out of the daze. I start thinking, I'll get out of here. I'll walk away from this bastard and his collection of walking excrement, and I'll go back to where I don't have to think about any of this. Then we cut to another splash page of John's life, And we see him, Brendan, and Kit sitting in front of Brendan's house that's on a cliff next to the beaches in Ireland. And they're all smiling and laughing, and they look like they're having a great time. And the text says, "There were good times for Constantine as well as bad. Years ago, on warm summer evenings on the edge of the Dublin Mountains, he'd sit with Brendan Finn and Kit Ryan, and inwardly rejoice that there was someone who'd care for him and spare a word or two of kindness in a cold, rotten world. Brendan, faults and all, was the finest man he'd ever met, and Kit was young and beautiful, a sparkle in her eye and a laugh that ran out like liquid gold. They'd drink and talk and smoke opium at sunset as a cool breeze slipped in off the sea, basking in the warmth of friendship and cloudy haze of the drug. He could have stayed there forever, and perhaps he should have, spurning the gray land across the Irish Sea for nights of laughter and life itself that became morning before you could draw a breath. The whiskey did flow like the wine, as the old song goes. Sadly for Constantine, the time went just as fast." And then we turn the page and we see the King of Vampires is in his hell-like domain, although I don't think it's actually hell. It's somewhere in between Earth and hell, I guess. And he is sitting on a throne. We see that he's got like bat wings. At the base of his throne, there's some naked vampire ladies. And then in the foreground, we see another demon-looking vampire that is looking into a pool with some kind of fish in it. It's weird. He's like splashing into the pool. And the text says, "They live deep inside the planet, feeding on ancient things that no human should ever have to look upon, resting their cold, pale skin against the icy rocks. Down there in the gloomy Hades, unreachable by man, the king of vampires holds his court and rules his legions with the love of the dead, like a morgue attendant who cares just a little too much for his charges. Unspeakable pleasures are indulged in those passageways and chambers, and plans are made for visits to the world above to taste all too briefly the thrill of opened throat and spilling vein. They consult rock pool oracles where blind fish with useless swollen eyes swim to and fro, shaping the vampire's world with the flick of a fin or the twitch of a tail. And so in the dark they live, as they've lived for time immemorial, content with a land of blackened stone and bone-pale rock, a madman's wonderland where no one need ever grow old. The dead don't age." Then we come back to John and the King of the Vampires talking again. And the vampire, after killing that guy, is trying to ease John again, trying to get him to relax. And John's not having any of it, of course, because he just saw the King of the Vampires rip open a man's head and drink his spinal fluid. So John tells him, "Well, I've had enough. Getting a load off your mind's one thing. Having a bloke who sucks people's spinal fluid as your confidant, that's something else. So why don't you quit all the pally shit like I said before?" And then the King Vampire begins to laugh, and John asks, "What's so bloody funny?" And the King Vampire answers, "I'm sorry. It's just the little act you put on, that's all. Just an ordinary bloke with no time for this hocus-pocus nonsense. It's very good, but it doesn't work with me. It doesn't hide the fact that you're one of the most intelligent, able, and daring occult figures that's ever lived. That's why I want you." And John misunderstands that for a second and thinks the man is either going to rip open his brain and eat it, or maybe just turn him into a vampire. So he's like, hold on a minute. But the King of the Vampire says, No, I don't mean that. I mean I want you to work for me." And John doesn't get it. He says, "Work for you? What as? A blood donor?" And the King of Vampires answers saying, "As a gatherer of knowledge, you can tell me when the various players in a magical game plan their moves against me, so that I can strike first. They'll all know you and whatever you've done, but they'd never suspect you were with me, my spy." And John replies to this job offer saying, "It's all out of my league, chum. You've got the wrong man. I hardly know what anyone is up to these days. All I want to be is left alone for the bad shit in my life to sod off and die. I don't do anything anymore." And then the King of Vampires turns and says, "Really? What about what you did to the 3 Lords of the Fallen? If that isn't special, I don't know what is." Then we cut to a splash page of the first in hell, and that is the first meaning Lucifer, I believe. They just call him the devil here, but I'm assuming that's who it is. And he's sitting on his throne in hell, and he's in the thinker's pose, and he's holding the neck of someone that he's strangling, and we see there's all these like wires that are hanging like hands and feet and limbs and arms and torsos and everything. It looks like this might be the room that he plots his revenge against Constantine in. And the text box says,
The devil sits alone drinking the bile of whores in a room where living flesh screams from garrote string walls and the damned chant litanies of despair from far below. It fails to lift his spirits for an instant. For months there has been one word on his lips, a name he mouths with all the hatred that only a billion years of ruling in hell can breed. Constantine. The things he'll do in vengeance for the double insult he was dealt are beyond all horror. He's making plans that will shake all creation, that will entangle even his despised brothers, that will cause abominable slaughter of innocents and damned, and all for one objective, to bring him the Englishman's soul. The Lord of Hosts and his whelp and the Holy Phantom are all forgotten. One thing matters now, one thing only, and he'll scream it from Akron's pits to the shores of paradise. John Constantine is doomed.
Then we cut to another splash page, but this one is of the King of Vampires, and this one is set in the future where the Earth does not have any humans on it anymore, and the sun's rays are so dim that vampires can walk during the day. And we see the King of Vampires is standing along the shore of a rocky beach, and he's staring at the horizon where the sun is either rising or setting, I'm not 100% sure, and he's looking pretty happy. He's got his arms held out like he's basking in the rays. And the text says, "Countless billions of years from now, when the cooling sun dips beneath the lying planet's horizon, its rays little more than a breeze on his skin, where once they'd have burnt him to ash. The vampire will stand on the shores of a stagnant sea and look out over the world he drank dry, and he'll smile. It'll be a smile of fond memory for the times he's had, and his mouth will run with drool at the thought of all those throats that parted before his razor teeth and the veins that emptied across his lapping tongue. And it'll be a smile of hope and delight for the future, because while this earth is exhausted, there are thousands more in the heavens above, young worlds that have never known his touch, a universe to choose from. He'll rejoice then, knowing that he's unstoppable, that out in the myriad of starfields there are plenty of mortals with dreams for better times that will never come, and that he'll be there to revel in their misery and harvest them like cattle. For the King of the Vampires, the future is bright." Then we come back to the conversation between John and the King of Vampires, and the King of Vampires has stood up and is walking towards John, and he says, "We have a lot in common, John. We walk apart from the common herd, don't we? Because we know things they don't and wouldn't want to, and they despise us for being different." And as the Vampire King gets closer, you can tell John is kind of nervous because he's getting sweat on his forehead, and he says, "That's a load of balls, mate. I've had all sorts of prats trying to convince me I'm like them. It's an old trick, and you can shove it up your arse. You and I have nothing in common." And we get a very imposing shot of the King of Vampires standing in front of John, and you can see he kind of towers over John by like a foot. And he replies, "Oh, why are you so sure? Have you any idea what it's like to be a vampire? Ever been tempted to find out? You can forget all the fairy tale stories for a start. Garlic is sour, but then so's lemon. A stake through the heart is like a cut finger. Running water makes you itch. And crucifixes, Bibles, holy water, all that bullshit. It's like magic. It only works if you're stupid enough to believe in it. Except for sunlight, you're indestructible. And the things you can do. Your strength is that of a hurricane. You can charm the strictest virgin into a slut. You can walk across moonbeams and go anywhere in the world in an instant. As for the feeding, relax. What was disgusting when you were immortal becomes a delight. It is better than sex. Your teeth are so sharp you don't feel the skin tear or the wall of the vein part. And the blood? Imagine sinking your teeth into the choicest leg of lamb and have the most exquisite claret rush down your throat. And best of all, it never ends. You can do anything you want forever." So John throws up a little bit of a protest question saying, And what about your victims?" And the King of Vampires says, "Screw your victims. They're just bloody livestock. Since when have you been a vegetarian?" So while the King Vampire has been trying to convince John that vampirism is cool and that he should like to be a vampire, John has been kind of biding time. You can see he's trying to figure out how to get out of this. He doesn't want to die, but he doesn't really see how he can get out.
And as he's thinking about this, his narration says, "It's beginning to look like the best I can hope for here is death, hopefully on a permanent basis." So he takes a deep breath and he tells the King of Vampires that he's not interested. And the King of the Vampires says, "But you don't have to be just at the moment. Work for me. Bring me your reports on the others. And soon, when you've seen what my life is like, you'll start to want yours to be the same. And I'll be happy to make it that way. Come on, John. We can do great things together. We can forge something new and dark and beautiful. And those idiots will never stop us with their bloody foolish magic. There's a whole world out there, and I'm hungry." And when the King Vampire said these last lines, he put his hand on John's shoulder, and John looks fucking terrified, like he thinks he's about to be killed. And also, we get a panel of a close-up of the King Vampire smiling, and you can see his teeth, and it looks like he's beginning to drool. Then we cut to another splash page, and this one's for the vampire, and we see a forest in the night, and we see wolves and a man running through the woods. And the text says, "They're out there in the night, waiting to feed. When the sun goes down and the comforting light is eaten by the shadows, they'll be there to catch us, thriving on our fears and hatreds and everything that drags us down from what we might become. Half the world is always night, and so is always theirs. Pray they don't get greedy for the rest of it. The King of the Vampires wants our blood for all the evil he knows he'll find there, and he'll never go hungry." Then we cut to a splash page of John, and it's just him in a close-up where we see his face and he's bringing a cigarette up to smoke, and his eyes are looking sideways like he's looking at someone suspiciously. And the text says, "There's been a lot said about John Constantine, all right, and everyone who knows him has their own pet theory. Really, though, he's just a man. Perhaps one day, if we let him, he can be a hero." Then we cut back to the conversation with John and the King Vampire, and all of the vampire's minions and followers have surrounded him and John. And John looks at him after he has made this offer of working for him and promising that he will turn John into a vampire. John pulls out a cigarette, lights it, and takes a big drag off of it. And then he blows out the smoke and smiles at the vampire and says, "If you're so hungry, why don't you just eat shit?" And this is not at all what the King Vampire was expecting to hear. He gets very angry and yells, "What?" And then John says, "You heard. Jesus, that's got to be the worst job offer ever. You've been listening to me bitch about all those other arseholes, and you haven't even twigged why, have you? I don't want to be some sort of friggin' Superman. John Constantine, servant of the Dark One. Christ's sake. I mean, you'll be wanting me to wear a Ponzi hood and start waving a wand next." And the King Vampire says, "But if you hate those idiots so much, why are you passing up a chance to wipe them all out? You'd have immense power." But John continues saying, "Oh, that'd be great. I'd end up like you prick. God, you're hopeless. You think I'm putting on an act, huh? A man of mystery pretending to be an average Joe, right? I don't suppose it occurred to you it might be the other way round. I'm happy with the life I got. Thanks." And the King Vampire snaps back, "Why? What's so freaking good about it?" And John answers, "'Cause I know who I am. I'm real. I don't forget about it like all those others do. And that's why they're all so mysterious, by the way, so no one figures out there's bugger all to them." And the King Vampire says, "And what's so good about being real then? Can you tell me? You seem very sure of yourself, you little mortal bastard. So, I'll tell you what. If you can tell me why your ordinary piss-boring life is better than mine, you can walk out of here alive. And if you can't, I'll cut your throat and drink my fill and leave you here half alive forever." And John looks at him and smiles and says, "Easy. Can you go for a walk in the park and hear the birds sing in the morning? Can you kiss a girl and know she loves you? Can you go out and get pissed with your mates? I can. And just so we're sure who's better off, why don't we sit here together and watch the sun come up in an hour or so?" And the King Vampire gets furious and says, "Shut up! Shut the frig up! Get out of here!" And then John looks at him straight in the face and says, "Be glad to." And then he begins to walk off in the woods back the way he came, and the King of Vampires is shouting at John as he walks away saying, "Don't celebrate too soon, Constantine. You're in a lot of trouble. What you did to the first of the fallen hasn't been forgotten, and you've set things in motion you're not going to like. Mark my words, you whoreson bastard. If I don't get you, somebody else will. Are you listening to me, damn it?" And as John walks away, you see him kind of like wave with his hand back in the general direction of the King Vampire, kind of telling him to go away. Then we cut to the King of Vampires, who's still surrounded by his acolytes, and one of the female ones says, "Sire, he's gone, and the dawn is on its way. Let's go below. There's fresh beasts in the pens, and we can drink our fill before we sleep." And as all the acolytes run away, the King of the Vampires kind of stands there for a second and says, "I've lost my appetite." And then he turns and he looks back where Constantine was walking and he says, "Bastard." Then we get to a nice sunrise in the park as John leans against one of the trees on the outskirts of the little park they were in. And he's smiling all happy. He's smoking, of course. And he's looking at the sun, and his narration says, "Magic. It's a cold winter's morning. The frost lies like lace on the pavement. The sky's a brilliant blue without a single smudge of a cloud. And the sun's so bright it's almost shouting aloud how good it is to be alive. And after surviving a night like that one, who am I to disagree? Home to Kit now. Hope she won't be too busy. I think I fancy another 3 days in bed." And then John kind of laughs and chuckles as he walks back to Kit's apartment. And that is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.